The footage was never meant to be released to the public, at least that's what the report said, buried under layers of internal documentation and labelled as a malfunction incident. But the problem with calling something a malfunction is that it suggests a clear cause, a simple explanation, and what happened inside Elevator 6 that night had neither, which is why the file kept resurfacing, passed quietly between departments, copied onto drives that were never logged, because no matter how many times it was reviewed, no one could explain it. It started at 2:13 a.m. The building itself was almost empty at that hour. Just a few security staff and cleaning crews scattered across different floors, and the elevator cameras were part of a standard monitoring system. Nothing special, black and white footage with a timestamp in the corner, the kind of thing no one pays attention to unless something goes wrong. And for the first 30 seconds, nothing did. The elevator doors opened on the 12th floor. A woman stepped inside. She looked normal at first glance, mid-20s, dressed casually, no visible signs of distress, but there was something about the way she moved that felt off. Not wrong exactly, just slightly delayed, as if her body was reacting a fraction of a second after her mind. And when she turned to press the button panel, her hand hovered there for a moment longer than necessary, like she was trying to remember which floor she had intended to choose. She pressed L. The doors didn't close. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Elevator doors pause all the time if something interrupts the sensor, but she stepped back, waiting, glancing toward the hallway as if expecting someone else to enter, and when no one did, she leaned forward again and pressed the button a second time, more firmly this time, as though the extra pressure would force a response. The doors remained open. That's when her behaviour changed. She stepped backward into the corner of the elevator, her eyes fixed on the empty hallway outside, her breathing becoming visibly uneven, and then, slowly, she began to speak, her lips moving in quick, hushed bursts as if responding to someone just out of frame. But there was no one there. No shadow, no movement, nothing that the camera could capture, and yet she nodded, shook her head, gestured with her hands like she was in the middle of a conversation. The audio feed had no sound. Security would later confirm that the system didn't record audio in that elevator, which meant whatever she was hearing, whatever she was responding to, existed only for her, or something the camera couldn't detect. She suddenly stepped forward again, pressing multiple buttons in rapid succession, her movements frantic now, her composure completely gone, and then she froze, completely still, her head tilted slightly to the side like she was listening. The hallway outside remained empty, and then she stepped out of the elevator, not all the way, just 1 foot across the threshold, her body leaning forward into the empty space as if something had called her, something just beyond the frame, and for a moment she stayed there, half inside, half outside, suspended between leaving and staying. And then she pulled back suddenly, retreating into the elevator as if she'd just realised something too late. The doors still didn't close, and that's when the footage started to glitch. Not dramatically, not in a way that would immediately raise alarms, just a subtle distortion, a brief flicker across the screen, the kind you might miss if you weren't looking closely, but when the image stabilised again, something had changed. The woman was no longer alone. There was still no one visible in the frame, but she had moved. Pressed tightly against the wall, her eyes fixed on something directly in front of her, something at eye level, something standing exactly where the empty space had been just seconds before, and whatever she was seeing, whatever had entered that elevator without appearing on camera, it had her complete attention. She didn't blink. She didn't move. She just stared. And then, she smiled. For several seconds, nothing happened. At least nothing obvious. The woman remained pressed against the wall of the elevator, her eyes locked onto that same empty space as if something stood inches away from her, something the camera refused to acknowledge. And then she began to nod slowly, as though listening to instructions, her expression shifting from fear to something far more unsettling, a calm, almost understanding look that didn't belong in that moment. And without breaking eye contact with whatever she was seeing, she reached out her hand into the empty air, stopping just short of touching something that wasn't there. Her fingers trembled. Then, she pulled her hand back sharply, as if burned, her face twisting into confusion, then panic, her mouth opening in what looked like a silent scream. And suddenly she started pressing the buttons again, faster this time, almost violently, her movements erratic, desperate, like she was trying to force the elevator to move, to escape. But the doors remained open, unmoving, as if something was holding them in place, and then she froze again. Not gradually, instantly. Her entire body went rigid, her hand still hovering over the panel, her eyes wide and fixed on that same spot. But now, something was different, because her gaze shifted slightly upward, tracking something that appeared to be moving, rising slowly from the floor to just above her height, and as her eyes followed it, her head tilted back further and further, until she was staring at something that, if it were real, would have been far taller than any person could be inside that elevator. The footage flickered again, just for a split second, but when it returned, her position had changed. She was no longer against the wall. She was standing in the center of the elevator, facing the corner, her back to the doors, her shoulders tense, and her arms hanging loosely at her sides, like she had been placed there rather than moved. And slowly, almost mechanically, she raised her hand again, this time higher, as if reaching up towards something above her, her fingers stretching into empty space, trembling as they stopped inches from something. And then she stepped forward, just one step. But it wasn't her movement that made it disturbing, it was the timing. Because the moment her foot touched the floor, the elevator lights dimmed slightly, not enough to plunge the scene into darkness, but enough to make the shadows shift, enough to make it feel like something had changed in the room itself, like the air had grown heavier, thicker, and she seemed to feel it too, because her breathing became visible again, shallow, uneven, her chest rising and falling rapidly as her eyes darted around for the first time, no longer fixed on a single point but searching, scanning, as if whatever had been in front of her was no longer there. But something else was. She slowly turned her head toward the doors. The hallway outside was still empty, completely still. And yet, she took a step back, then another, as if something had just appeared there. Her lips began moving again, faster now, frantic, her head shaking as if she was refusing something, arguing with something that couldn't be heard, and then suddenly she stopped, her expression going blank, her body relaxing in a way that felt completely unnatural, like a switch had been flipped, and without warning she stepped forward again, calmly this time, deliberately walking straight toward the open doors. She crossed the threshold and disappeared from view. The elevator remained open, empty, still, for exactly 12 seconds. Then, without any input, without any button being pressed, the doors closed on their own, and the elevator began to descend. Security would later confirm that no one had called the elevator from any floor, no one had entered it, and no one exited on any level. But when the doors finally opened again, the elevator wasn't empty anymore. The doors opened slowly, as they always do, revealing the lobby floor exactly as expected, empty, quiet, undisturbed, and for a brief moment everything seemed normal again, as if the past few minutes had been nothing more than a glitch in the system, a sequence of strange but explainable events that could be written off and forgotten. But then the camera adjusted, the lighting stabilizing just enough to reveal what stood inside the elevator, and that's when the report notes became inconsistent. Because according to the official log, the elevator was empty. But the footage said otherwise. Standing in the center of the elevator was the same woman. Except something was wrong. She wasn't facing the doors, she wasn't moving. She was standing perfectly still, her back turned to the camera, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, slightly to the side as if listening to something behind her. And for a few seconds nothing changed. The frame remained static, silent. The kind of stillness that makes you question whether the video is frozen. But then slowly, almost imperceptibly, her head began to turn. Not her body, just her head. Rotating further than it should have, further than was comfortable, until her face came into view, her eyes wide open, unblinking, staring directly into the camera. And what made it worse wasn't the angle, or the stillness, or even the way she seemed to be aware of something beyond the frame. It was her expression. She was smiling again, the same smile. Calm, knowing, wrong. And then she spoke. Not loudly, not clearly, but her lips moved. And for the first time in the entire footage, something else responded. The lights inside the elevator flickered violently, the image distorting in sharp bursts, frames skipping, tearing, as if the system itself was struggling to process what it was seeing. And in one of those flickers, just a single frame, something appeared beside her. Not clearly, not fully, just a shape, tall, standing just behind her shoulder, gone in the next frame. But it was there, long enough to be recorded, long enough to be noticed. The footage stabilized again, But she was no longer smiling, her expression had shifted into something else entirely. Something empty. Something distant. Like whatever had been inside that elevator with her was no longer separate, no longer outside of her. And slowly, in perfect sync with nothing visible, she raised her hand and waved. Not at the camera, at something standing just behind it. The screen cut to black immediately after that. No transition, no fade, just gone. The official report concluded that the footage showed signs of visual distortion caused by the electrical interference, and the case was closed within 48 hours, filed under system malfunction, no further investigation required. But the building itself didn't agree with that conclusion, because within weeks, complaints began to surface, quiet at first, easy to dismiss. Reports from late-night staff about elevators opening on empty floors, about buttons lighting up without being pressed, about the feeling of being watched inside confined spaces, and then, eventually, the cameras started picking things up again. Not clearly, never clearly, just enough to notice. A shadow where there shouldn't be one, a figure just out of frame, a reflection that didn't match. And always elevator 6. It was taken out of service shortly after. Sealed. Disconnected from the system entirely. But the last note in the file wasn't written by maintenance. It wasn't written by security. It wasn't even signed. Just a single line, added days later, buried at the bottom of the report where most people wouldn't think to look. The elevator still moves. Even though it shouldn't. Even though it can't. And sometimes, when the doors open on a floor where no one is waiting, the camera inside flickers, and for just a moment you can see her standing there, not alone,